Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Rick Fussell and this is the Engraving Workshop. In today's video, we're going to be making a set of chisels. We're going to be making a paring chisel and then a set of skew chisels. These are specialty chisels and are often used in cutting dovetails. That's coming up next here at the Engraving Workshop. While standard bench chisels do most of the heavy lifting here at the Engraving Workshop, every now and then I need a more refined touch. That's where specialty chisels come in, and today we're making a set of paring and skew chisels that will make your dovetails weep with joy or fear. Either way, they'll notice. For the blades, you'll need 3 pieces of 1095 high carbon steel, each one an 1/8 inch thick, 2 inches wide, and 12 inches long. Next up, 3 pieces of brass flat stock, 1/16 by 3/4 inch by 8 inch, a 12 inch length of 5/32 inch brass rod, and another 12 incher in 3/32 of an inch. To class up the handles, we'll use 3 brass 3/8 inch gas flare caps for ferrules. They're not shown here, probably because I haven't went to Home Depot to purchase them yet. And of course, I'm reaching for my go-to black walnut for the handles. But feel free to pick your favorite hardwood. Just don't tell the walnut, it's got a bit of an ego. Links to all the materials are down in the video description because, I care about you guys. I'll also zoom in on the design and dimensions for the 3 blades, the brass bolsters, and the steel bolsters. So you can pause the video or grab a screenshot. No need to squint or guess what I did and hope for the best. First up, I painted both the steel and brass flat stock black. Why? Because it makes the scribed layout lines easier to see, and also because black just looks cool, like tactical chisels. Then I cut out my paper drawing. It's to scale except for the blade length, and used that as a template to transfer the design onto the steel blank. Nothing fancy, just good old paper and patience. Next, I grabbed some scrap plywood to use as a straight edge and start cutting off the bulk of the waste from the blade. I stayed about 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch away from my scribed lines, because once you cut past the line, you've officially entered the oops zone. And I try to keep my mistakes off camera unless they're funny. This gave me a chance to break out my budget-friendly Harbor Freight angle grinder, and I've got to say, for the price, it did exactly what I needed it to do. Sure, it sounds like a jet engine on its 3rd cup of coffee, but it chews through steel just fine. Sometimes cheap tools get the job done just with a little extra noise and a dash of drama. But don't sweat it. With a little elbow grease, you could cut everything out with a hacksaw if that's what you've got on hand. Might take a little bit longer, but hey, that's just more quality time in the shop. Speaking of hacksaws, that's exactly what I used to cut out the steel bolsters. And to my surprise, I was able to get pretty darn close to the lines, which meant less filing and less time turning my forearms into Popeye. Always a win in my book. Now don't toss the cut off steel just yet. The bulk of what I just trimmed off is going to get a second life as the steel bolsters. Around here we believe in recycling, especially when it saves a few bucks and a trip to the metal supply store. With the bulk of the material removed, I switch to the hacksaw and take out most of the waste in the curved areas. From there, it's time to clamp the blade in the vise and start filing down to the lines. I'll be putting every file in my arsenal to work, starting with a good old crosshatch flat bastard file. It's aggressive, it's ugly, and it gets the job done. As I get closer to my layout lines, I'll switch over to a finer smoothing file to sneak up on the final shape. The same process works for the blade, the tang, and the shoulders. For the decorative concave curves, I'll grab my round files to rough them in, then smooth things out with a coarse sanding drum. You don't have to get fussy at this point. Final shaping and polishing will come later, after the 2 bolster pieces are riveted onto the blade blank. Next up, I'm hitting all 3 blades with some 80 grit sandpaper to clean things up and get rid of any surface rust or scratches. Just enough to make them shine without making them too pretty to use. Quick note on dimensions. The paring chisel comes in at 3/4 of an inch wide and 12 inches long, while the 2 skew chisels are each 1/2 inch wide by 9 and 15/16 inches long, because apparently I don't believe in round numbers. Now all I'll need to do is cut a 30-degree tip on both skew chisels. I used a protractor to scribe the angle onto each blade, and yes, I still own a protractor. Never underestimate the power of old school tech in a modern shop. I'll take those over to the oscillating belt sander to grind down the angle. And while the final skew angles need to be opposing mirror images of each other, we'll cut them both the same for now. We'll reverse one of the bevels later when we start shaping the top and bottom. It's a bit like twins, identical until you give one a different haircut. With the blades shaped, it's time to start working on the bevel edges. The decorative bevel along the top edge isn't just for looks, though it does add some style points. It also softens the edge and helps the chisel sneak into tight corners without scraping up everything around it. Form and function just the way we like it. To create that bevel, I stuck the blade into a wide hardwood plank using double-sided tape. The thickness of the blank matches the width of the blade, which raises it up just enough to give me clearance for filing without digging into my workbench. After clamping the blank in my vise, I marked the top edge of the blade with a red permanent marker, partly to help me see the line and partly because red just makes it feel more official. With my caliper set to 3/32 of an inch, I scribed a guideline down both sides of the blade. Then I grabbed a coarse file and started removing the bulk of the waste. When it comes to filing bevels, long, even strokes the full length of the blade help keep everything nice and consistent, kind of like mowing a tiny, very shiny lawn. I'll stop filing once there's about 1/32 of an inch of flat left along the edge. Then I finish it up with a fine file and 120 grit sanding block to smooth everything out. And here's the final profile on the paring chisel. Clean lines and a nice subtle bevel along the top. I'll go through the same process on both the skew chisels to keep the family resemblance strong. At this point, the only thing left to tackle on the blades is grinding the rough bevels. We're getting close to the business end now, literally. I cut, ground, and filed the brass and steel bolsters the same way I did the blades, so I'll spare you the deja vu. No need to watch me file metal again unless you're really into that sort of thing. That said, the top edges get a slightly different treatment. For the brass bolsters, the bevel is just a light chamfer, about a 32nd of an inch, since the material is only a 1/16 of an inch thick. On the steel bolsters, the chamfer is a little bit beefier at 3/32 of an inch, matching its 1/8 inch thickness. Now there's also a taper along the top of each steel bolster. It starts thick at the tang and gradually narrows down to about a 32nd of an inch toward the tip. I cut that taper using an oscillating belt sander, taking my time and giving it regular dunks in water just to keep the heat in check. Trust me, glowing red steel looks cool, but it means you're doing it wrong. At this point, you should have a completed paring chisel blade and 2 skew chisel blades, each with those opposing angles we talked about earlier. And now you can really see how, depending on which side you file the top bevel, you can either mirror the tips or give each one a different haircut. It's chisel styling at its finest. The only thing left to do on the blades is grind the rough bevels. We're almost there. On the bolster front, we've got 3 completed brass bolsters and 3 steel bolsters all ready to go. It's starting to look like something now, and it's not just a pile of shiny metal parts anymore. With all the pieces prepped and ready, it's time to start assembling them onto the blade blanks. First, I marked the rivet hole locations using a center punch. A little tap now saves a lot of wandering drill bits later. Then I aligned the bolster pieces on each blade using CA glue or good old super glue. Just a few dots to hold everything in place while I clamped it up for a few minutes. Doesn't take much. We're not gluing a bowling ball here. Once everything was snug in a line, I headed over to the drill press and drilled the 4 rivet holes straight through the whole stack. I started by drilling all the holes with the 3/32 inch bit first, even the one that'll eventually be a 5/32 of an inch. It's a lot easier on the drill bit, the drill press, and your nerves. Once those were through, I swapped in the 5/32 inch bit and opened up the one hole to its final size. That step-down approach keeps the heat down and helps prevent wandering and blowout. For the rivets, I'm using short lengths of brass rod. Simple, strong, and look sharp against the steel. With the bolster stack lined up, I use a ball-peen hammer and a little built-in anvil on my vise to mushroom the rivet heads. Just gentle taps at first to start the spread, then firm wax to lock everything down tight. It's kind of like blacksmithing, but on a much smaller, slightly more civilized scale. Once everything's secure, a little filing and sanding smooths it all out so the bolsters blend in cleanly into the blade. No sharp edges, no proud rivets, just clean lines and solid construction. Now for the business end. It's time to grind the rough bevels. All 3 chisels will get a 25-degree bevel. The 1095 steel is soft enough at this stage that forming that bevel is pretty straightforward. You could go old school with a honing guide and some coarse sandpaper, but I've got a bevel jig for my grinder, so I went with the powered route. Faster, cleaner, and a little more dramatic, just the way the supervisor likes it. With the jig set at 25 degrees, I slowly grind the bevel, stopping often to dunk the blade in water to keep the metal cool. Overheating can ruin your temper, both the blades and mine. Now, if you're grinding a skew chisel with a jig like mine, here's a little tip. You'll need to install the blade into the jig at a 30-degree angle to the wheel. That way you'll still end up with a proper 25-degree bevel along that skewed edge. Sounds weird, I know, but trust me, it makes sense once you see it. Now, since 1095 is a pretty soft steel in its raw state, it won't hold a sharp edge for very long, so we need to harden it. To do that, I heat the cutting end of the blade until it reaches an orange-red glow. I keep a magnet handy too. Once the steel loses its magnetism, you know it's ready for the quench. And speaking of quenching, my go-to is a can of vegetable oil I commandeered from the supervisor's kitchen. Don't worry, it's only slightly expired. I use MAP gas for this since it burns hotter than propane and heats the blade faster. You can use propane, it'll just take a bit more patience and possibly a second cup of coffee. Once quenched, the blade is hardened, but it also means it's brittle. So to temper it and make it durable enough to hold a sharp edge, I toss it in the oven at 450 degrees for 1 hour. When it comes out, it should have a nice pine straw color. That's your sign the steel is ready for work. After tempering, the blade and bolster clean up beautifully with some sanding and a quick pass over the buffing wheel with polishing compound. And a little shine never hurts anyone unless the supervisor finds out what I used to polish it. Now that the metal work is done, I can turn my attention to making the handles. I went with, you guessed it, black walnut. It's got that rich tone that pairs beautifully with both brass and steel. Classy, tough, and just rustic enough to say, yes, I made this myself. I cut 3 handle blanks, each roughly 1 1/4 inches square by 8 inches long. Then I marked the center on each end for mounting on the lathe. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using 3/8 inch brass gas flare caps for the ferrules. It gives it a clean transition from the blade to the handle, and let's be honest, it just looks sharp. First up, I need to drill a 1/8 inch hole in the end of each cap. I marked the center with a punch and used a wood clamp to keep everything steady while drilling. That little hole acts as a center point so I can mount the ferrule and handle blank together on the tailstock of the lathe after turning the tenon. Next up, it's time to turn a tenon on the end of the handle blank. The goal here is to get a snug fit that actually engages the threads inside the brass fitting, so precision matters. You'll want to maintain a clean, square shoulder on the handle. That helps the brass fitting seat tightly without any gaps. I use calipers to measure both the depth and inner diameter of the fitting, then turn the tenon on the lathe to match. Once I've got the right size, I use a skew chisel to cut a small chamfer on the end of the tenon. That just helps the fitting start threading a bit more easily. Then using a socket wrench, I slowly thread the brass cap onto the tenon until it seats snugly against the shoulder. Now here's a little cautionary tale. Don't over tighten. Brass is stronger than walnut, and if you crank down too hard, you'll snap the tenon clean off. And don't ask me how I know. Now it's time to mount the handle and ferrule assembly onto the lathe and start shaping. First, I rough out the handle using a roughing gouge to knock it down to a clean round blank. Once that's spinning true, I move on to the brass fitting. Turning the fitting round is easy enough. Just use a coarse file while running the lathe at low speed. Once it's close, I switch to a smooth file to dial in the final shape and get that brass looking sharp. The handle ends up about 5 inches long, tapering from 1 1/8 inches at the butt down to the ferrule. It's a gentle taper, sleek but still beefy enough to feel good in the hand. And let's be honest, there's something about a brass ferrule meeting up with black walnut that just makes a handle look expensive. Next, I need to drill a 5/16 inch hole about 2 3/4 inches deep to accept the tang. I did this before shaping the butt of the handle. Trust me, it's a whole lot easier to drill a square end than a tapered one. You can drill the hole right on the lathe using the tailstock, or pull the handle off and use a drill press. Either way works. Just make sure your aim is true or that tang's going to find daylight somewhere it shouldn't. With the tang hole drilled, I'll reattach the tailstock and shape the butt end of the handle. Once the shape is where I want it, it's time to sand. I start with 80 grit and work my way up through the grits all the way to 600, then give it a final once-over with a Scotch-Brite pad. I sand both the walnut and the brass ferrule together to blend them in nice and smooth. Once I'm happy with the finish, I take the handle over to the bandsaw, cut it loose, and hand sand the butt end, working through the same sanding progression. At this point, it's looking and feeling like a real chisel handle and smelling like roasted walnut from all that sanding heat. Here's where a little patience and a whole lot of test fitting really pays off. I start by rounding off the sharp corners of the tang. You can do this with a file or a grinder, either works, but make sure you take your time. Then I shape the hole in the ferrule to accept the tang. The goal here is a snug fit, not too loose, not too tight, kind of like trying on jeans after Thanksgiving. I'm aiming to seat the tang so the shoulders of the blade are about 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the ferrule before the final drive home. That way, with a few light taps, I can snug the blade in tight without splitting anything or having epoxy everywhere it shouldn't be. Before setting the blade, I taped everything off to keep it clean and apply a bit of epoxy into the tang hole and on the tang. Then, with a few controlled taps, I seat the blade until the shoulders sit flush against the brass ferrule. That's the magic moment right there, metal meeting wood, with just the right amount of persuasion. With the epoxy fully cured and the ferrule still taped off, it's time for the final touch, finishing the handle. I'm using tung oil, one of my go-to finishes for hardwood. It soaks in deep, brings out the richness of the walnut, and leaves a durable, natural sheen that feels right in the hand. I'll apply 3 coats, giving it a light buff with 4/0 steel wool between each one. It smooths out the grain and helps the next coat bond even better. Take your time here. This is where the handle goes from nice to wow. There's something deeply satisfying about making your own tools. These chisels didn't come off the store shelf. They were shaped with intention, fitted by hand, and finished with care. The paring chisel, long and narrow, is perfect for fine, flat cuts and cleaning up joinery. The 2 skew chisels, each cut at opposing angles, making quick work of tight corners, dovetails, and detailed trimming. Every file stroke, every tap of the hammer, every pass on the lathe, it all builds a deeper connection to the craft. These aren't just tools, they're an extension of the maker. And I'll tell you, it's a good feeling knowing that next time I reach for a chisel, I'll be using something I made right here at the Ingrain Workshop. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please leave it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. If you're new to the channel and you like DIY and woodworking projects, then I highly recommend that you smash that subscribe button. It's free and painless, and I'd also ask that you ring that bell icon. That way you'll be notified of all our upcoming videos. To all my existing subscribers, I really appreciate all the support you've given this channel. Now, I'll leave links in the video description below to all the material that I used on this build, and that's one way you can support the channel. And if you're really feeling generous, you can always leave us a super thanks. We greatly appreciate it. I'm Rick with the Ingrain Workshop. Until next time, have a wonderful day and God bless.